The grim news on the European economy just keeps coming. New figures today show Spain's recession is deepening, and later this week the European Central Bank will make its next move to stop the euro from fracturing. The Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman believes the solution is stimulus spending, exactly the opposite of what the Europeans are doing with their austerity plans. Professor Krugman has a new book out, End This Depression Now, and he joined me from New Jersey. Professor Krugman, in your book you write that the current set of economic policies in Europe is a disaster and that in the US they're not going to be enough to end the economic slump there. Why?
We've just had really an epic collapse of private spending. We've just seen that because of various things, mostly overreach, excessive private indebtedness, the private sector has just cut back drastically on spending, both sides of the Atlantic. This is a North Atlantic crisis. What we should be doing right now is we should have government policies that are designed to sustain spending, because somebody has to spend. Your spending is my income, my spending is your income. And if you don't do that, then you have a persistently depressed economy. But what we've had instead over the past couple of years is a policy mix that focuses on trying to slash government spending, treats the government deficit as if it were the main problem, as opposed to the lack of jobs, which is actually the main problem. And then in Europe, you have the overlay of the problem of a single currency without a single government, which adds a whole additional level of difficulties. So we have a great disaster. You know, we're basically 5 years into this crisis, and in many respects, things are still getting worse.
But if you argue that governments should keep spending, then where does that money come from? Aren't you creating a long-term problem for yourself?
Well, in the short term, first of all, the money actually comes from the fact that the private sector wants to save. The private sector wants there's a lot of desired saving with no place to go. And as long as the government is considered to be a reasonably long-run solvent institution, then the private sector is eager to lend that money at very low interest rates. Long-term, yeah, there is an issue. By all means, let's do things to bring the long-run budget into balance. But the fact of the matter is that 1 year's deficit makes very little difference to the long-run prospects, but makes a huge difference to employment prospects. So now is the time to spend. Later, after we've recovered, is the time to worry about those budget deficits.
Do you believe Europe will fracture?
I think that could go either way. I'm reasonably sure that Greece is going to be kicked out one way or another. Probably in the very near future. Then there's a set of dominoes that are ready to fall unless the leaders of Europe take extraordinary action to prop them up. And it could very easily fall apart. I mean, it's not at all hard to tell a story where over the next few months the euro breaks up. It's actually much harder to tell a story where the Eurozone manages to hold together on a sustained basis.
You mentioned the strength of the Australian economy compared to the United States and Europe. Australia's been resilient partly because China buys a lot of our resources. How effectively can Australia rely on China's growth to protect it against global economic jitters going forwards?
Well, you know, a bad enough disaster can catch anybody. A bad enough global disaster can send commodity markets plunging, and China is certainly weakening right now, so that's an issue. I have to say, it's looking like we're increasingly a resource-constrained world, which is good for countries like Australia that have resources to export. But there's no security. I mean, there is no safety in life. You have to have smart economic policies to ride through crises, whatever it is that you produce. And I worry a little bit about Australia. You worry a little bit about housing, you worry a little bit about consumer debt. There's some sense that I tend to put Canada in the same box, that Australia and Canada may be, the fact that they didn't experience the same crisis as the US and Europe in 2008 doesn't mean that they might not have a delayed version of some of the same problems in the years ahead.
Earlier this month, Australia implemented a carbon price of $23 a tonne. How does that compare to what the rest of the world is doing?
Well, the rest of the world is basically doing nothing. And that's, I mean, Australia is to be applauded for that. It's a step in the right direction. Every estimate I've seen says that the right tax on carbon would be substantially higher than that, and but of course it should be implemented globally.
If the rest of the world is basically doing nothing, though, then is implementing a carbon price to Australia's advantage or disadvantage?
I think at that level of pricing, it's not going to do any significant damage. And there is a possible economic upside if at some point the evidence for climate change becomes so overwhelming that even the American right can't deny it anymore, at which point the rest of the world will be scrambling to catch up, and those countries that started to take precautionary measures first will have an advantage.
Professor Krugman, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.